يا راغبا في كل علم نافع.
ينمو العلم ويتقدم بتقنياته ومجالاته، ومعه نطور أدواتنا في تقديم العلم الشرعي. أكاديمية زاد.
زاد أكاديمية ينبوعها صاف ليروي غلة الظمآن. هذه عقيدتنا الصحيحة فطرة تنفي الشكوك بواضح البرهان. بشرى لنا زاد أكاديمية للعلم كالأزهار في البستان.
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. الحمد لله رب العالمين، والصلاة والسلام على أشرف المرسلين نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. Continuing with the names and attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the correct belief in the names and attributes of Allah according to the way of the people of Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah as part of the Islamic creed, the second level. In this class, inshallah ta'ala, we'll talk about some of the attributes of Allah, or these things that are attributed to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that nothing about them is mentioned in the Quran and in the Sunnah of the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam, whether to deny it or to affirm it. So words that people initiated or invented, or they say it, that is not mentioned in the Quran and in the Sunnah of the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam. And they would use these words like, for example, the word al-jiha, direction, or al-hayyiz, the area that is occupied, or al-jism, which is the body, for example, and the like of this. What is the correct way of understanding that? Very clearly, to be consistent, it is not for anyone to initiate or to establish any of the attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala without having dalil, without having evidences from the Quran or from the Sunnah of the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam. We use the words that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala used in the Quran and in the Sunnah of the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam. So a person would say, but some of these words can mean certain things. Like, for example, if we say in English, that one of the attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the hands. The word hands is not mentioned. We're translating it. So a person might ask, what do you mean by the word hands? This is the word that refers to the yad. So it's basically to understand what a person means by this, but first of all, the words are to be avoided if it's not mentioned by the Quran or the Sunnah of the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam. So if someone asks, do Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala have a jiha? A jiha is the direction. Is there a direction to Allah? Because when we talked about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the Most High is above His creation subhanahu wa ta'ala. For those who say that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is everywhere, this is wrong, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala described Himself as He's above His creation, over His throne subhanahu wa ta'ala. So this is what we say, the words that are used in the Quran and in the Sunnah of the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam. So the words like this, we do not establish it, we don't say and use it. Why? Because it's not mentioned in the Quran and in the Sunnah of the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam. But if someone said that word al-jiha, as some of the ulama they say, then we ask them, what do you mean by this? Do you mean by that the creation of Allah is surrounding Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? That means He is within His creation. Of course, this is a falsehood. This is not something that is correct. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, nothing encompasses Him. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala above all of His creation. Nothing is the like of Allah. And this is how some of the people, whatever the intentions are, when the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, when the young girl was asked, where is Allah? She said, Fis sama, in the heavens. So they say that means as-sama, which is makhluqa. As-sama is a creation of Allah. Encompasses Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Of course not. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is above His creation. And this is what is meant by Fis sama, above His creation subhanahu wa ta'ala. So nothing encompasses Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. وَسِعَ كُرْسِيُّهُ السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ. So this is very clear. But if they refer to al-jiha, or the word al-jiha, direction, that means Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is above His creation. We just said now, this is a correct meaning or a correct belief that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is above His creation. But we don't use that word that they invented. So this is to be clear. So this is where a believer should be upon. We don't use these words because some of those who deviated from the true belief of the people of Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah, they would claim things where the people of Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah, they distance themselves from. So they say if you believe that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has hands and so on, which is something that is already stated and established in the Quran, they say that means you claim that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has a body. The word body is mentioned. We don't use the word body. We don't use the word body parts as they claim. They make mockery of the people of Ahl Sunnah. They say the people of Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah, they claim that Allah has body parts. So they talk about body parts. They're lying. The people of Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah, they never say these words. They only state what's in the Quran and in the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. It's a matter of ghaib and unseen. And they don't go beyond that. So this is a very important aspect of it, that we have to be careful and not to say since therefore. So for example, what's mentioned, or some of these words that they talk about, al-hayyiz, or when someone occupies a certain area, right? And of course, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is nothing is the like of him. So when they say something like this, this word is never used in the Quran and in the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. So if they claim that the makhluk or the creation of Allah is surrounding again, and it's the Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is occupied by the creation, of course this is all falsehood, right? And if they refer by this is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is away from his creation, above his creation, this is what the proper belief in. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is above his creation. So the same thing with all kinds of things. So it's when it comes to, again, this word, al-jism and al-arad and the like of this. So if they say the word jism is body, as I mentioned just before, is that word is used in the Quran and in the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ? The answer is no. Then we stay away from using these words, right? And this is how a believer saves himself. The word is not used, and the meaning, if you want to have the correct meaning, is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has whatever he attributed to himself. Anything that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala attributed to himself in the Quran or in the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, we believe in it. And we say that we understand the meaning of it and how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best of how. And we don't get into the, this how because it's unknown to us, and to ask about it this is actually the results of, again, this ilmul kalam, the philosophy, or talking about things that is not in the Quran and the Sunnah. People using their limited way of thinking in talking about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this is what the nations before they fell into deviation because of not respecting and not following the revelation from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So they would make all kinds of judgments or all kinds of analogy based on what they see with their own eyes. And this is a matter of unseen to us. And if it's unseen, that means we have no capacity whatsoever to know it except by the wahy from Allah, the revelation from Allah. And the revelation from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, nothing is as clear as the Quran. And what's muhkam and mutashabih in the Quran, because this is what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, هو الذي أنزل عليك الكتاب منه آيات محكمات هن أم الكتاب وأخر متشابهات. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala revealed the book of Allah. Some verses are muhkamat, clear, and some verses are mutashabihat. That means can mean more than one thing. And the ways of the people of deviation, فأما الذين في قلوبهم زيغ فيتبعون ما تشابه منه ابتغاء الفتنة وابتغاء تأويله وما يعلم تأويله إلا الله. The ayat. The people, those who have deviation in the hearts, they follow the mutashabih, the verses that can mean more than one thing, to alter the meanings of it. So what is then the way of the people of the truth and the people of Ahl Sunnah? These verses that talks about mutashabih or things that can mean more than one thing, they describe it in the light of the muhkam, in the light of what is clear. So what is mutashabih in the names and attributes of Allah is the kayf, is how these attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala are. So we say Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. But the meaning of it, it's very clear, and nothing is the like of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So again, this is a principle and something to be careful with by not falling into the trap of using words that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala did not use, or the Messenger sallallahu alayhi wasallam did not use to describe or to talk about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the same way when it comes to our dua and things like that and our acts of worship. We'll stop here inshallah ta'ala. We'll continue with more of the subject of the belief in the names and attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but next time by the will of Allah. Wa sallallahu wa sallam wa baraka ala Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
يا راغبا في كل علم نافع
ينمو العلم ويتقدم بتقنياته ومجالاته، ومعه نطور أدواتنا في تقديم العلم الشرعي. أكاديمية زاد،
زاد أكاديمية ينبوعها صاف ليروي غلة الظمآن. هذه عقيدتنا الصحيحة فطرة تنفي الشكوك بواضح البرهان. بشرى لنا زاد أكاديمية للعلم كالأزهار في البستان.